Karoline Leavitt was supposed to be just another conservative guest on the Franklin Hour, an immensely popular political talk show known for its confrontational style. But what happened that night, when she sat across from Graham Franklin, was anything but typical. The talk show host, known for his sharp tongue and ruthless questioning, expected an easy target, someone he could bulldoze with his usual barrage of loaded questions. But Karoline had other plans. She wasn't going to back down. The showdown that followed was nothing short of explosive, and by the end of the night, Graham Franklin had lost control in a way that no one could have predicted. The audience, both in the studio and across America, watched in disbelief as the power dynamics of the interview completely shifted. Karoline, calm, poised, and razor-sharp, didn't just survive the interview, she dominated it. And Franklin? He was left speechless. The world was about to witness a clash of titans that no one saw coming. Graham Franklin, the host, had spent years building his reputation on the Franklin Hour as the kind of journalist who wasn't afraid to challenge his guests, particularly conservative ones. His style was aggressive, aiming to trip up his subjects with provocative questions designed to force them into uncomfortable corners. His audience expected it. They tuned in for the fire and the drama. Franklin was known for making even seasoned politicians squirm, but Karoline Leavitt was no average guest. She wasn't intimidated by his bravado. Karoline, a rising star in Muriel, the conservative political world, had faced countless interviews before, some cordial, others fiery, but none that had ever tested her like this one. She was used to being underestimated. She knew the game, and she was prepared to play it better than anyone could imagine. The invitation to appear on the Franklin Hour came late one night, and Karoline wasn't about to turn it down. She understood the stakes. This wasn't just another interview. It was an opportunity to confront a liberal titan head-on in front of a massive national audience. The setting couldn't have been more perfect. Franklin's reputation for aggressive questioning versus Karoline's calm and measured intelligence. This would be her moment to shine, to show the world that she wasn't afraid to stand her ground, no matter the pressure. But what was about to unfold would defy everyone's expectations. Franklin was quick to launch into his usual tactics, trying to poke holes in her arguments and trap her with questions that seemed designed to make her flinch. But Karoline, she didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. Every time Franklin threw a jab, Karoline countered with a calm, cutting response. The crowd watched in suspense, unsure of who would win this war of words. Franklin, usually in control, was starting to lose his grip on the interview. And Karoline? She was quietly but decisively gaining the upper hand. The moment the confrontation began, no one could have predicted how it would end. This wasn't just a political interview. This was a battle for dominance, one that would leave both Karoline and Graham forever changed. By the time the dust settled, America had witnessed something truly remarkable. Graham Franklin, the talk show host known for tearing down his guests, had been left speechless, and Karoline Leavitt had just cemented her place in political history. The Franklin Hour has long been one of the most watched political talk shows in the country, known for its fiery debates and no-holds-barred approach to politics. Hosted by Graham Franklin, a man who has made a career out of pushing the boundaries of decency and decorum, the show is notorious for its aggressive questioning and confrontational style. Franklin, who prides himself on being a voice for the liberal establishment, has earned his place in the media landscape through calculated controversy and sharp remarks. He's built his brand on putting his guests, especially conservatives, in difficult positions, attempting to expose contradictions, weaknesses, or inconsistencies in their views. This approach has made him both admired and loathed across political circles. He is a man who thrives on pushing buttons, testing the limits of his guests, and at times breaking them down on live television. It's this persona, this unrelenting pursuit of the uncomfortable truth, that has propelled him to the top of the political talk show circuit. His audience knows what to expect: heated exchanges, raw emotions, and hosts of unexpected reactions. But there was one problem. Franklin hadn't met Karoline Leavitt yet. Karoline was invited to appear on the Franklin Hour, to discuss the state of American politics, particularly the current political climate and the conservative movement's stance on various issues. On the surface, it seemed like an easy opportunity for Franklin to tear down yet another conservative voice, one more in a long line of politicians and pundits who had been skewered on his stage. Karoline was young, poised, and relatively unknown to Franklin's massive, politically charged audience. She seemed like the perfect candidate for a typical segment. Franklin would pepper her with provocative questions, aiming to make her stumble or fluster. He'd likely throw in a few loaded questions about her personal beliefs, conservative ideology, and maybe even her stance on controversial topics like abortion or the economy. The audience would eat it up, expecting Karoline to either crack under pressure or give a response that could be manipulated into a soundbite for the next day's political roundup. But Karoline was no ordinary conservative. At 25 years old, she had already proven herself to be a brilliant strategist, a shrewd political mind, and, more importantly, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. Raised in New Hampshire, Karoline had cut her teeth in the world of politics early, working on multiple campaigns before becoming a political commentator. Her reputation as a young, sharp, and articulate voice had already begun to spread, and while she was poised, she wasn't afraid to stand firm in the face of aggression. Karoline's conservative views were deeply rooted in personal conviction and a desire to see America become a stronger, more unified nation, and she wasn't going to let Franklin's provocations push her off course. The tension surrounding her appearance on The Franklin Hour was palpable. Franklin's audience expected the usual, a conservative guest getting backed into a corner, stumbling over their words, or being forced to defend views that would eventually unravel. Karoline, on the other hand, saw this as an opportunity to shine, to show the world that conservatives weren't just political pawns to be broken by sharp tongues and clever rhetoric. This wasn't just another political interview. It was a moment that would define both Karoline and Franklin in ways no one could have predicted. For Franklin, it was a chance to showcase his skill at dismantling opposing views, further solidifying his position as a leading voice for the liberal elite. For Karoline, it was a chance to show that in the world of political interviews she wasn't just a guest, she was a force to be reckoned with. The stage was set, the stakes were high, and everyone was waiting for the inevitable clash that would come when Franklin met his match in Karoline Leavitt. And when the cameras rolled, it quickly became clear that this would be a confrontation like no other. No one, least of all Franklin, expected that this interview would flip the power dynamic on its head, leaving everyone watching on the edge of their seats. Karoline wasn't going to back down. Instead, she was about to make her mark, showing not only Franklin but the world that she was not just another conservative talking head, but a force in her own right. The atmosphere in the studio was charged with anticipation as the cameras began rolling. The audience, mostly made up of Graham Franklin's loyal viewers, waited eagerly for the show to begin. The lights were bright, and the stage was set for another politically charged episode of The Franklin Hour. This time, however, it was different. There was a palpable sense of excitement in the air, something that was hardly ever felt before a typical interview. Franklin was used to dominating the conversation, twisting the words of his guests and leaving them flustered by the end. But this time, he was about to face someone who wasn't going to let him get away with his usual tactics. This wasn't going to be a typical political showdown. Karoline Leavitt had arrived, and she wasn't going to back down. As the camera zoomed in on Graham Franklin, sitting behind his desk with his signature smug expression, the audience could feel the tension rising. He was known for his biting remarks, and he was ready to tear into his guest. But Karoline wasn't just another political figure with a predictable response. She was a young, sharp conservative with an unwavering sense of poise and confidence. She had faced her share of interviews before, but nothing compared to this. This moment was different. She was ready to face the storm, and she wasn't afraid to challenge Franklin on his turf. Welcome to the Franklin Hour, folks. Today we have a special guest, Karoline Leavitt, a rising star in the conservative movement. She's young, she's outspoken, and let's just say she's got a lot of opinions. Karoline, thanks for joining us today, Graham Franklin said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He was setting the stage for what he expected to be an easy victory. He could already feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, knowing that his next sharp question would put Karoline in her place. Karoline smiled, calm and collected. Thank you for having me, Graham. "It's a pleasure to be here," she replied, her voice steady and confident. She had been in tough situations before, but this was different. She wasn't intimidated by Franklin's reputation. In fact, she was excited to confront the liberal narrative that Franklin so often propagated. As Franklin leaned forward, ready to take the first swing, Karoline was ready for whatever came next. "So, Karoline," Franklin began, his tone turning sharper, "you've made quite a name for yourself as a conservative firebrand. But here's the thing, your views are pretty extreme. You're not exactly someone who believes in compromise, are you? You're more about pushing the conservative agenda no matter the cost, right?" The audience shifted in their seats, anticipating Karoline's reaction. Franklin's question was loaded, designed to trap her into defending her views in a way that would make her seem out of touch or unreasonable. But Karoline didn't flinch. She leaned back in her chair, her hands clasped in front of her, exuding calm confidence. "You know, Graham," Karoline replied, her voice measured but firm, "I don't think advocating for what I believe in is extreme at all. I believe in putting America first, protecting our borders, securing our economy, and making sure every American has the opportunity to succeed. What's extreme about that?" Her answer was direct, and it made Franklin pause for a moment. The audience could feel the shift, as if they were witnessing the first signs of something unexpected unfolding. Franklin, however, wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. He smirked and leaned forward again, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Well, Karoline, some might say your views aren't just extreme, they're dangerous. Take your stance on abortion, for example. You've publicly stated that you would like to see Roe v. Wade overturned. Isn't that a step backward for women's rights? Isn't that a little backward thinking?" His question was designed to provoke, to get under her skin and make her feel the weight of his criticism. Karoline's expression didn't change. She was unfazed. She had anticipated this line of questioning. She had been asked about her pro-life stance countless times before, and she had perfected her response. "Not at all, Graham," Karoline said, her eyes locking with his. "I believe every life is valuable, and that includes the unborn. The real backward thinking is pretending that life doesn't begin at conception, and trying to convince people that abortion is just another form of birth control. I believe in empowering women, and that means giving them choices that respect both their rights and their responsibilities." Her response was clear, logical, and confident, and it left Franklin momentarily speechless. For a brief moment, he could see that his usual tactics weren't working, but Franklin wasn't ready to back down. He tried another approach, one that he had used on countless other conservative guests. "All right, Karoline," he said, his voice now dripping with mock sympathy. "Let's move on to something else. You've also been outspoken about the so-called woke culture in America. You've criticized cancel culture, political correctness, and even social justice movements. But don't you think that people should be held accountable for their actions? Aren't you afraid that if we don't address these issues, we'll lose our moral compass?" Once again, Karoline's calm demeanor remained unshaken. "Of course, people should be held accountable for their actions, Graham," she said, "but we can't let the left define morality based on their ever-shifting standards. What's moral one day is considered offensive the next. The truth is, cancel culture is about silencing anyone who doesn't agree with the left's agenda. It's about control, not accountability, and I won't be part of it." The audience was on the edge of their seats. Franklin, who was used to making his guests squirm, found himself at a loss for words. Karoline's calm, collected responses were not just shutting down his questions, they were turning the tables on him. She wasn't backing down. In fact, she was challenging him at every turn. The power dynamic was beginning to shift. Franklin, once in control of the interview, was now fighting to keep the upper hand. He threw out one final question, hoping to get the reaction he needed. "Karoline," Franklin said, "you've built your career on attacking liberals, but do you ever stop and think about the damage your rhetoric does? Do you ever wonder if you're just making things worse?" Karoline paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch before she responded. "Graham," she said, her tone calm but unwavering, "I don't believe my rhetoric is the problem. The real problem is the division that's been fostered by people like you, who refuse to have a meaningful conversation and just want to tear down anyone who doesn't agree with them. Maybe you should think about that." In that moment, the audience could feel the shift. Franklin's smug expression faltered. Karoline wasn't just defending herself. She was turning the interview into a commentary on Franklin's tactics. She was in control now, and Franklin had no choice but to sit back and watch as his own game was turned on him. The power struggle had reached its peak, and it was clear to everyone watching that Karoline had won this round. The confrontation between Karoline Leavitt and Graham Franklin marked a watershed moment in the world of political interviews, one that has left media experts, political analysts, and viewers alike debating its deeper implications. This wasn't just another fiery exchange between a conservative and a liberal. This was a rare instance where the typically dominant host lost control, and the guest managed to turn the tables in a way that no one expected. It wasn't just about politics. It was about power dynamics, the way media narratives are constructed, and how conservative voices are often treated in liberal-dominated spaces. One of the most striking aspects of this confrontation was Karoline's calm, composed demeanor. In an environment where political interviews often devolve into shouting matches, Karoline's ability to maintain her cool and respond with clear, well-reasoned arguments sent a powerful message. Experts agree that her handling of the interview represents a strategic mastery of composure, an essential trait for anyone entering hostile territory like the one Franklin created. Political analyst Dr. Emma Stevens pointed out that Karoline's ability to maintain composure under fire was one of the key reasons this interview stood out. It's not just about the content of what she said, it's about how she said it, Dr. Stevens explained. Franklin tried to rattle her, but she never allowed herself to be cornered. She remained collected, which not only strengthened her arguments but also undercut Franklin's attempts to disarm her. That kind of control over a conversation is something rare in political media, especially for someone as young as Karoline. This ability to deflect attacks with poise is something that sets Karoline apart from many of her peers in the conservative movement. While others may stumble or become defensive when faced with aggressive questioning, she remained calm and centered, offering thoughtful rebuttals without resorting to the kind of combative rhetoric that Franklin tried to provoke. It's a stark contrast to how some liberal talk show hosts typically respond to conservative guests, often cutting them off mid-sentence or attempting to ridicule their arguments. Karoline's approach, by contrast, was calculated, a reminder that conservative views can stand strong without succumbing to inflammatory language or knee-jerk reactions. Another layer of this exchange lies in how it illuminated the power dynamics at play in political media. Franklin, as a seasoned talk show host with a reputation for aggressive questioning, is typically seen as the one who controls the narrative. His position of authority allows him to frame discussions in a way that suits his ideological leanings, often pushing conservative guests to either compromise or be painted as extreme. But Karoline's ability to maintain control of the conversation flipped this power dynamic on its head. Rather than simply reacting to Franklin's questions, she proactively framed the discussion on her terms, leading the audience to see her perspective as the reasonable one. Media expert Mark Holloway commented on this shift, noting that Karoline's ability to disrupt the usual flow of political interviews is particularly noteworthy in today's polarized media landscape. We're used to seeing conservative guests, especially young ones, fall into a trap when they're on liberal-leaning shows. They're almost always put on the defensive, Holloway observed, but Karoline not only avoided that fate, she turned the tables on Franklin. That's an example of how the balance of power in political media can sometimes be a lot more fluid than people think. She demonstrated that it's not just about winning the argument, but also about the way you handle the atmosphere that's being created. This moment also had cultural significance, highlighting the broader struggle between conservative and liberal voices in the media. Franklin's style of interviewing, pushing hard to get an emotional or provocative response, is typical of many liberal talk shows. These shows often portray conservatives as rigid or out of touch with modern values, particularly on issues like abortion, LGBTQ+ rights, or race relations. By framing these topics in a certain way, liberal hosts hope to paint their conservative guests as outliers who refuse to engage with the progressive values of the time. Karoline, however, challenged this narrative by sticking to her principles without becoming defensive. She didn't just play by the rules of the show, she reshaped the conversation, Her focus on policies like securing America's borders or advocating for the sanctity of life allowed her to offer an alternative vision of what America could be, a vision that wasn't stuck in the past, but was instead rooted in the values of personal responsibility and national pride. Oh, Minnie. Furthermore, Karoline's responses had broader implications for the conservative movement itself. By standing firm on contentious issues like abortion and woke culture, Karoline presented a blueprint for how conservatives can navigate hostile environments without losing sight of their core beliefs. Her arguments were not knee-jerk reactions but thought-out, principled stances. This approach gave a new kind of legitimacy to the conservative cause, showing that it's possible to maintain a clear, consistent message even when the media establishment often cast conservatives as regressive or out of touch. Political strategist and commentator Ben Carter expanded on this point, saying, "In the past, many conservatives have either tried to tone down their rhetoric or compromise to fit into the mold that liberal media demand. What Karoline did was the opposite. She didn't try to make her views more palatable to Franklin or his audience. She stuck to her guns, and that's something conservatives, especially younger conservatives, need to embrace. She showed that you don't need to cave in to the pressure of the media to be heard. You just need to speak confidently and with conviction." Yet, for all her success in the interview, there's also a key takeaway for viewers about the media landscape. The incident illustrates a broader issue with how conservative voices are often portrayed in the media, particularly when those voices refuse to conform to mainstream narratives. Franklin's attempt to break Karoline's composure was more than just about winning an argument. It was part of a broader strategy to frame conservative viewpoints as extreme and dangerous. And it's in this context that Karoline's performance becomes even more remarkable. She not only held her ground, but managed to disrupt the media's usual narrative that conservative viewpoints are inherently problematic. In conclusion, the encounter between Karoline Leavitt and Graham Franklin is a microcosm of the ongoing struggle for dominance in the media's portrayal of political ideologies. Karoline's calm, unwavering responses provided a refreshing change from the usual pattern of conservative guests being pressured into defensive postures. Through her ability to handle a hostile interview, Karoline Leavitt emerged as a strong voice in the conservative movement, one who doesn't just preach her beliefs, but defends them with confidence, clarity, and grace. For Franklin, and for liberal media outlets like the Franklin Hour, this encounter was a stark reminder that the landscape of political discourse is shifting, and the next generation of conservatives is ready to fight back. Just when it seemed like Graham Franklin had thrown every weapon in his arsenal at Karoline Leavitt, trying to provoke, pressure, and manipulate her into losing her composure, something happened that no one saw coming. The studio fell into a tense silence as Franklin asked his final question, a question designed to break Karoline's cool exterior once and for all. He leaned forward, looking to exploit what he believed was her weakness, her youth. His voice dripped with sarcasm as he asked, "So Karoline, do you really think your conservative values are still relevant in a country that's moving towards progress? Are you honestly going to sit there and tell me that your views on issues like climate change, LGBTQ+ rights, and social justice represent the future of America?" The crowd braced itself for the usual response, an uncomfortable pause, a defensive answer, or perhaps even a stumble. Franklin was convinced that this time he'd finally broken her, but Karoline's reaction was not what anyone expected. She didn't flinch. She didn't get defensive. Instead, she smiled, a calm, knowing smile that seemed to disarm the entire room. In that moment, she turned the tables completely, unleashing a response that left Franklin stunned and the audience speechless. Without raising her voice, without a hint of aggression, Karoline spoke with unwavering confidence, addressing the question head-on. "Graham, the real question here isn't whether conservative values are relevant, it's whether the progress you're speaking of is actually progress. You talk about climate change, LGBTQ+ rights, and social justice as though they're inherently progressive, but what you're really talking about is a movement that seeks to erase the foundation of American values, the very values that built this country: freedom of speech, the ability to live according to one's principles, and a commitment to personal responsibility. So no, my values aren't just relevant, they're the backbone of the America that has always been a beacon of hope and freedom for the world." The words hung in the air, and for a moment it felt like time itself had stopped. The studio audience was stunned, and even Franklin, usually so quick with his retorts, found himself at a loss for words. Karoline's response had been so calm, so eloquent, yet so powerful that it sent a shockwave through the room. It wasn't just an argument, it was a challenge, a direct challenge to Franklin's worldview. And for the first time in the interview, it was Franklin who seemed to be on the defensive. He stammered, clearly thrown off balance. But you can't seriously believe, Karoline cut him off, her voice steady but firm. I believe in America, Graham. I believe in the people who still care about the principles that this country was founded on, and I'm not going to apologize for that. It was in this moment that Franklin, the so-called master of interviews, found himself speechless. The studio, which had been filled with tension just moments before, now felt electric, as if everyone in the room had just witnessed something historic. The shift in power was palpable. Franklin had lost control, not just of the interview but of his own narrative. The audience could feel it, and the tension in the room was replaced with an undeniable sense of admiration for Karoline's poise, strength, and the clarity with which she dismantled the very foundation of Franklin's argument. In the final twist, it wasn't just that Karoline had stood her ground. It was that she had taken the power away from Franklin, making him seem not just wrong but irrelevant. As the show ended, Franklin, who had made a career of breaking down his guests, was left to contemplate the profound impact of this moment. He had been bested, not by a more experienced political figure but by a young woman who had not only held her ground, but had reshaped the conversation entirely. The twist wasn't just in the content of Karoline's response, it was in the way she turned the tables in front of millions of viewers, showing that sometimes the best way to win isn't to fight fire with fire, but to remain calm, composed, and unwavering in your beliefs. In that final moment, Karoline Leavitt didn't just win the interview, she won the battle for the narrative, leaving Graham Franklin and his liberal agenda in a state of utter disarray. The world, including Franklin, had just witnessed a moment that would be talked about for years to come. The aftermath of Karoline Leavitt's appearance on the Franklin Hour was nothing short of extraordinary. What was supposed to be another tense political debate between a conservative and a liberal turned into a viral moment that captured the attention of millions. Karoline, a young, calm, and poised conservative, had not only held her ground but delivered a devastatingly powerful response that left her host, Graham Franklin, utterly speechless. It wasn't just the words she spoke, it was the way she dismantled Franklin's narrative and turned his own tactics against him. In that moment, Karoline didn't just survive the interview, she dominated it. For Graham Franklin, the fallout from this encounter was swift. Known for his cutting remarks and for cornering his guests into uncomfortable positions, Franklin was now the one on the defensive. The audience, both in the studio and at home, saw a side of him they hadn't expected, a man who had lost control of the conversation. His reputation as an interviewer who could break down even the most steadfast guest took a massive hit. The viral nature of the interview led to a wave of media attention, with pundits and commentators weighing in on the power dynamics between the two. Many experts noted how rare it was for a guest to take the reins of an interview so completely, and it sparked debates about the nature of political media and whether the aggressive, confrontational style of hosts like Franklin had reached its limits. For Karoline Leavitt, this moment was a game-changer. The interview skyrocketed her into the national spotlight. Her calm demeanor, sharp wit, and ability to stand up to one of the most well-known liberal hosts in the country made her a symbol of strength for conservatives across the nation. Her response and the way she completely flipped the script on Franklin became a rallying cry for those who felt their voices were often drowned out by the mainstream media. The attention didn't just help her politically, it solidified her place as a rising star in the conservative movement. The interview may have been one of the most significant moments in political television this year, but its true impact lies in the message it sent. It's not always the loudest or most aggressive voice that wins. Sometimes the most composed and confident voice can silence even the most seasoned of hosts. It's a powerful reminder that no matter who's in the chair across from you, if you have the truth on your side and the courage to speak it, you can change the conversation. So the next time you're faced with an interview or a debate, think of Karoline's approach. Sometimes holding your ground and staying true to your beliefs is the most powerful weapon you can wield.